Hello guys, this is Panzer 36. Today's video is going to be update number 2 on my Panzer III in North Africa buddy build that I'm doing with Hamilkar Barkas. If you don't know who Hamilkar Barkas is, he's another YouTube modeler just like me. He's a very nice German guy. His videos might be in German, but he has excellent English subtitles so you can understand what he's saying if you don't speak German. He's one of the original big YouTube modelers. He's been doing this for a lot longer than I have, and his videos were some of the ones that inspired me to start making my own videos like 5 or 6 years ago. So he's one of my great friends, and I'm very honored to be doing a Panzer III buddy build with him, where we are both building these nice desert Panzer IIIs. He's doing a little bit different one. His is an Ausf G. This is a late Ausf H, so it's a little bit like a later Panzer III, but it's still the same kind of thing. It's a North Africa Panzer III. We're both building little dioramas with them too, which we will cover in the next updates. In the previous update, I covered the building process, which was mainly fixing the issues the Dragon has with this kit, and also adding a bunch of unique features to make this tank look more DAC and make it look more like the 8th Panzer Regiment of the 15th Panzer Division, which is the specific unit that I'm modeling. So, along with moving the spare tires and giving it like spare track armor everywhere, that makes it look pretty DAC. I've also done some unique features to make it a vehicle of the 8th Panzer Regiment, 15th Panzer Division. So you'll notice that there's like a spare, or not spare track, but like spare stowage kind of rack on the rear there where there's some wood planks over it. That's something that the unit did. You might also notice that the spare tires, or I guess on this side you have to see that, but the spare tire on the back right there, and also the rubber of the tires has been painted white. We will cover that later, but that's another feature of this unit. And also the markings, of course, are to model the unit as well. So after I finished building it, which was covered in the last update, I have painted and weathered it almost completely. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, most of my tanks, I don't actually prime them because I don't use that much resin or photo etch, but this tank had a lot of photo etch because I added like spare stowage racks and jerry cans, stuff like that. So there's a lot of photo etch, and there's also some resin because I added a spare, or like a spare part that I had, which is a Panzer Art gun mailer with this nice canvas cover that looks really DAC. So I put that on, and as such this model needed some primer to make the paint adhere to all the resin and photo etch nicely. I used the Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in the red oxide color because it looks perfect for German red primer. If you're going to do hairspray chipping and you want to show red primer showing through, you could always just use just that and spray it on because it looks perfect for the red primer. After I applied the primer, I went with my base German gray, which is how these tanks, I think, were painted. I think they were painted gray, and then over top of that was the tropical camouflage. So for that, I used some of the new AK, or relatively new AK Real Color RAL 7021, which is Dunkelgrau Panzer Gray. And I believe I ended up lightening it with a little bit of this white here from the AK Real Color line, because the color is probably accurate because it's really, really dark. Panzer Grays are really dark. People like to think it's very light and blue, but really it's a very, very dark gray. Looks like basically rubber tire color. I applied that over the tank, and the reason I lightened it was because it's showing through only in small chips, so I want it to be a little bit lighter so it doesn't look almost like black when it's showing through next to the camouflage. If I'm doing a normal tank that's all gray, I would have left it more dark. After I applied the gray, I covered the model with a couple of thin coats of hairspray. You could also spray on chipping fluid with your airbrush, it's the same thing. And then once that had dried, I painted the top colors of camouflage. Now, most of the desert tanks that are in North Africa were painted in RAL 8000, which is the standard DAC, like yellowish brown color. AK Real Color also has a very nice color for that. I think this is perfectly historical accurate in terms of how the color looks. Some tanks were also painted with about 30% coverage of camouflage splotches of basically a slightly more green color, which is RAL 7008. So that's what I did on this tank here. Now, the photos of this tank, of this unit, I guess I should say, it's really hard to tell if this camouflage was actually applied or if they were just in the RAL 8000 base color, because the camouflage is very, very subtle. If you look at Tiger 131, which has been restored very, very accurately, it also has this exact same camouflage pattern with the RAL 8000 and about 30% coverage in RAL 7008. However, the AK Real Color for 7008 is a little bit too pale. It looks almost exactly the same as the RAL 8000 over here. So for that reason, I lightened it with a little bit, or I guess I greened it up a little bit with AK Real Color 4BO Russian Green, about 50-50 mix, and that gave us a little bit of a more greenish tint, and I think that was perfect for the color I was after. So if you're going to model this camouflage pattern, I think you should probably try those mixes there, because that looked really, really good. The AK Real Colors are lacquer paint, so I thinned them with Tamiya lacquer thinner and just airbrushed it on with my airbrush, and it was pretty smooth. Feels a lot like Tamiya paints because they're very chemically similar. So remember, I applied hairspray before I applied the camouflage colors on top. So for that reason, we can do what we call hairspray chipping. So like after the paint's dried, I get a little bit of water on a brush, and I can rub at the edges. The paint will soak through the top layers of the camouflage, the yellow and the green, and it will hit the hairspray, which is on top of the gray. So hairspray will dissolve and remove the upper layers of paint, which are the yellow and the green, and expose the underlying gray. And depending on how you move your brush around, you can basically rub at edges and then expose the gray there, and it looks exactly like chipping effects. I love hairspray chipping. It's really, really fast, a lot faster than brush chipping. And on tanks like this, where there is a lot of exposure of the underlying color, it's a lot nicer as well, because you get some really nice looking in-scale chipping effects, and it's really nice, and I think it looks better than brush chipping so much coverage. You can also use masking fluid and stuff like that, but this is what I like to do there. Now I didn't go crazy with the chipping because tanks didn't get that chipped up, so I managed to keep it pretty light. Most of my chipping is around areas that make sense, so like the wheels get pretty sandblasted. Areas around the hatches where the crew would be getting in and out would see a lot of wear and tear from the crew walking around, so the cupola and the hatches there are pretty worn. Hatches on the front as well. Just think about where the tank would get worn, like fenders as well. They get pretty beat up. But that's kind of a nice effect you get with hairspray chipping. It looks pretty cool. So if you're doing a DAC tank, I recommend you try hairspray chipping if you haven't already. So with the paint applied, I need to apply the markings. Now I had a bunch of references for these tanks, and I specifically looked for a number that didn't exist in photographs so I could put that number on my tank, because this is kind of a mishmash of a bunch of tanks, even though in general all the things on it mimic the 8th Panzer Regiment of the 15th Panzer Division. All the features on this tank were never on one specific vehicle. I kind of made it up and applied a bunch of features from different tanks to make one that was like the most interesting. So I picked a number which I couldn't find anywhere else, which is 514, and I applied that, as you do. You first apply a gloss varnish, then you apply the decals with some setting solution, and I actually ended up with decal silvering because, as I learned, and I've been learning a lot recently, applying a gloss varnish to make your decals not silver is not exactly how it works. To get no decal silvering, you need very, very smooth paint. You can have smooth matte paint, and you can have rough gloss paint, because there's micro and macro textures. The micro texture is what actually gives like the light reflection and makes it matte or glossy, while the macro texture is actually like the roughness of the paint. So I ended up with a gloss varnish, which of course has a very, very smooth micro texture because it's reflecting a lot of paint, but the macro texture had a lot of bumps and ridges in it, almost like a cast texture on a turret like this. So I ended up with a little bit of silvering issues because air gets trapped in the macro texture, not the micro texture. So there was some decal silvering issues. Not that bad, but that was kind of a learning curve for me, where you don't actually really need gloss if your matte base paint is actually smooth on the macro texture. A little bit complicated. I kind of want to do a video explaining this and showing it, but as for right now, I'm just going to keep it a little bit simple because it's kind of confusing. But basically I end up with a little bit of silvering and stuff like that. Some setting solution and sanding helped to kind of smooth it down afterwards, and it ends up looking pretty good. Later on I applied a matte varnish, and now it's basically impossible to notice that the decals were looking terrible before, but I will be overlaying a couple of photos that I took with my camera or on my cell phone, where you can kind of see the rough texture of the paint even though it's a gloss varnish. So yeah, I'm going to try to work better with my varnishes, my paint later on, so I can avoid those issues and maybe even avoid applying varnishes altogether, because I hate them. It's just a waste of time. So I guess I'll show you some close-up of the markings here, but Like I said, I'm modeling a tank that didn't exist from a unit that did exist. So there's a big 5 on the side of the turret there, and that's the company number. I picked the 5th company because they didn't have any numbers in the back of the turret, so I could avoid one decal. And then I used the rest of the Dragon decals, because they give you basically like a bunch of 5s, a bunch of 1s, a bunch of like 2s and 3s, and so you can kind of make your own number set. But I picked 514 because it didn't actually exist as far as photos show. So there's markings on the side there, 514 across, 5 on the turret side. Same thing on this side, though the 514 is kind of behind the jerry can rack. Might be able to just barely see it there. And on the back is also the 514 and the cross on the smoke candle. Pretty cool markings in my opinion, so I like this unit. They're pretty interesting looking. Oh, I guess I should point out that earlier on I mentioned this briefly, but the rubber on the tires has been painted white because that's what happened to this unit. It must have been some kind of a parade, because you can see photos of them, I believe in Italy or something like that, before they shipped over. Tanks are entirely gray, but the wheels are painted white, the rubber at least. And then when they painted them with this tropical camouflage, I guess they just left the white to wear off. So for that, I did a little bit more hairspray chipping. You know, after the tire's been painted, I just went over with more hairspray, a bit of AK Interactive Real Color White, and then just chipped it with some water. Quick and easy, and basically the same thing I did on the rest of the tank with the camouflage, but just with white on the rubber. That was done before the decals, but I kind of forgot to mention it. So with the decals and everything applied and the tank base coated, I did a little bit of tool painting, but that's pretty basic. I've got videos entirely on that. We have to kind of begin with the actual weathering. The first step in weathering I always do after chipping is apply a wash. Usually you guys know me as an oil paint aficionado, but on this one I actually just use a premix wash because I was feeling a little bit lazy and I was trying to see how basic I could go in this tank without, you know, basic but having cool results. So I went with a premix enamel wash. This is a Wilder Dark Rain Marks wash. Just mix it up, apply it with a small brush, and then clean up the excess with some enamel thinner. And there was still the gloss varnish from the decals on at this point, so that made the wash flow a little bit and easier to clean up. So after I finished cleaning it up, to lock it in and also to fix some of the decal film kind of showing, I then hit the model with some Tester's dull coat, probably like 4 coats because I was really trying to get rid of that decal effect, and it looks really matte now and there's no more decal issues, so it's tough to notice that there was any problem at all with the decals, but it looks pretty cool. I already showed you some close-ups of the decals, but I'll just kind of give you a once-over. There's also a little symbol there for 15th Panzer Division next to the driver's port, and there is the Afrika palm, you know, palm tree swastika looking thing. It's behind the spare tracks on the front plate, but it is over there. So with the wash applied, this is the point where I would usually go crazy with some oil paints for color modulation and subtle streaking effects. However, on this tank, I decided not to even bother with that because I knew that I was going to be applying some dust effects, which would blend the camouflage and create streaking effects, and would kind of eliminate the point of any color modulation at all with oil paints. So I didn't even use any oil paints on this model at all. The wash was a premix enamel wash, and the dust effects were done without any oil paints. I simply used this here, which is Wilder's Aqualine. It is a reactivatable acrylic effect. Don't think of this as an acrylic like we use for painting our tanks, because those are acrylics that dry permanently. This is a reactivatable acrylic because it's actually like a gouache paint or like a watercolor. So once it's dried, you can just put some water on it and it will reactivate, and it basically works a lot like an enamel, but it works with water instead of enamel thinner. So you can apply this on a model where you already have enamel effects with no varnish required, because your thinner to clean up the Aqualine is water, which will not reactivate oils and enamel paints because they need enamel thinner to reactivate, and vice versa. Enamel thinner won't reactivate the Aqualine. So it's kind of the same product, but it's a different chemical, so it's independent and won't damage previous effects. I airbrushed this product on based on what I saw Martin Kovac, you guys know as the Night Shift modeler, based on what I saw him doing on an old article on the Wilder website, where he's basically showing off the, at the time, brand new Wilder Aqualine effects. He airbrushed it on a Whippet tank and then used a damp brush to streak it to create some very nice looking dust effects. So I had some trouble airbrushing it on because I just couldn't get it to airbrush smoothly. I'm pretty not great at airbrushing, so I kind of just decided, I just kind of went like, screw it, it's not airbrushing nicely, but I'm going to blend it anyways. So I just airbrushed it on in a little bit of a pebbly coat. And then once it had dried, as it does immediately, I took a slightly damp brush with some water and just kind of rubbed it around as you would an enamel dust effect. I streaked it over flat surfaces that angled down slightly. On more flat areas that aren't angled, I just kind of moved into corners where dust would collect. And it looks amazing because, I mean, I don't think I could have done this with oil paints in any similar amount of time, because it took me like, I don't know, an hour or 2 hours to do that entire thing. Just airbrush it on, then move it around, and then kind of apply some more with a brush afterwards. But it looks super, super cool. It's very, very subtle. It looks like dust, and it also has some streaking effects. So if you see on the side of the turret there, front of the hull, you can see some streaking effects. On the top of the turret bin there, and the back you can probably see some more streaking. On more flat areas like the engine deck, it's just kind of built up, and also kind of, you could say, chipped it, or just kind of made areas where it looks like the crew's been kind of walking around and the dust has been kind of kicked and worn away from those areas. I did that in the same areas where I did chipping effects, and you can see on the exhaust, which is just the red primer showing through, there is simply the aqualine built up there, and you can kind of see the pebbly coat that it naturally gets there, which doesn't look that bad for like textured dust. Over here you can see I've streaked it. It's really nice for this effect, and I will probably try it again in the future because I am very pleased with it, and it was super easy. And also I can apply oils and enamels over top of this without any varnish required. So as of right now, the tank is, as it is. The only thing I've done since the dust is I've worked on some of the tracks. So that was just some basic pigments. The spare tracks here are painted with my usual track color, which is half and half mix of XF69 and XF72, which gives a nice dark gray. I airbrushed that on at the same time I did the tracks on the hull. And then I just simply worked over them with a dark gray pigment and a rusty red pigment, just kind of varying it a little bit over the spare tracks to give some more rusty and more like worn dark areas, just to give it some variation. And then after that I applied a dusty pigment. These are all Wilder pigments, I believe, but I just applied the dusty pigment over top, which was a very similar color to the aqualine effect, and that makes the tracks look dusty like the rest of the tank. For the tracks on the lower hull, the ones on the actual wheels, I painted them with the same base color. I didn't bother with the rusty pigments and stuff like that. I just brushed on the aqualine effect. Same thing I airbrushed on the upper hull areas. I just brushed it on with a brush and moved it around a little bit so it looks like built up dust in the tracks. And then I dry brushed with my finger a metallic pigment over the raised surfaces of the tracks to make them look like they are worn metal. And they look really, really good. And the wheels were just painted with some of the, they were airbrushed with the aqualine as well. So as of right now, there is no dust pigment on this tank except for on the spare tracks, I guess. And there's no oil paints on this at all. So I can actually, I can touch it. It's just aqualine, which is dry. Just the spare tracks are pigment basically, but I'm just trying to be careful because I don't want to wear off anything. Lower hull is just the aqualine. You can see the kind of speckly thing it gives, but I'm going to work on there with some pigments probably on the lower hull to tie it in with the diorama once I get there. But as of right now, the tank is basically complete. As you can probably tell, I was trying to keep it pretty simple in this video and not waste time with a bunch of crazy products that you can't see the results of in the end, like oil color modulation and dot filters and stuff like that. While that would usually be visible on a normal tank, this one has so much dust and fading on it that it looks like it's already been kind of worked on with oil paints. If I were to do color modulation and dot filters, those would be hidden under the dust basically. So I just kind of kept it simple. Hairspray chipping, tool painting. I applied a pre-mixed wash. I airbrushed on a dust effect and rubbed it with a wet brush. And then I painted the tracks with a couple of pigments basically, and used a metallic pigment on the worn areas of the running tracks. And that is basically everything so far. It was actually, despite it taking me a long time because I was really thinking about really thinking about, not taking much time, I managed to keep the tank process quite simple, and also keeping the results looking pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. So I guess that's a little bit of a lesson to you guys, that you don't need to be crazy with all these products to end up with a nice result. You can just chip your tank, put a wash on it and some dust effects, and it looks pretty cool. I'll give you guys a bit of a once over so you can see it here. As you probably saw some detail shots in the overlaid footage, but it looks, in my opinion, pretty awesome. Because I've got basic dust effects on there, some chipping, but it's not crazy dusting, it's not crazy chipped. It's just like a nice, kind of realistic looking, for a pretty beat up desert tank. It's it's not crazy, but it's pretty heavy looking. That's about it for today, guys. In the next update, I hope to bring you progress on the diorama I have. Oh, I have planned, I guess I should say. I haven't actually built it yet, but I have some pieces for it. I've got a wooden base, which I will use. Probably put some foam on that, carve it into the nice shape I want, which is a slight rise, the tank coming up like this, with our little commander looking for the desert rats to blow up with his 50mm gun or something like that. I've got a product called a crackle paste from the art store, which I think I can apply to the lower portion of the ditch this tank is in, which is going to be like a dry riverbed. Apparently you can apply this crackle paste, and once it dries it cracks and looks like dried crusty desert sand, so we'll see how that works. The rest will just be sand, probably a little bit of shrubs, but I do hope to be able to film that and give you guys a little bit of a tutorial on the diorama building, because that's pretty cool. I also want to update you guys eventually on the figure. Right now he's just a little torso with some binoculars, but I will paint him up so he looks like he's actually a human being, and he should look pretty good in the cupola there if he can sit properly. There we go. So that's going to be the next two updates, figure and diorama. If you guys have not yet watched Hamilkar Barkas's updates on his, I will recommend that you do, because he's also doing a very similar subject but with his own take on it. He's got his own way of chipping the tank, not using hairspray chipping. He's got his own way of doing dust effects and stuff like that, and he's also done a lot more work on the tools and stuff like that, because he's a lot better at hand painting, so he like hand painted all the tools and handmade like the canvas on the gun and stuff like that. He's a lot more skilled with his hands than I am. But his work is equally, if not more impressive than mine is, so I recommend you check out his diorama and his updates on that as well. As always, thanks for watching, guys. This is Panzer 36. I will see you next time. Huge thanks to the Patreon and PayPal supporters. Those guys really helped me out buying all the kits and paints and products for you guys to see in videos. Happy modeling. I will see you next week with the next update on this tank. As always, goodbye. See you next time.